I didn't believe in the idea of a haunted place. Not truly. Not until I spent a summer working the late shift at a rest area off I-94 in central North Dakota. It wasn't the kind of place that looked like it held secrets. Just a brick building with vending machines, fluorescent lights, and the ever-present drone of trucks idling outside. But there was a stretch of highway just west of the facility, known to locals as the Dead Mile, where the air always felt cold, even in July, and the feeling of being watched was a physical weight. I should have paid more attention to the quiet dread that clung to the evening custodian, an old man named Frank, whenever a certain type of vehicle pulled in. The rest area was located on a particularly desolate stretch between Bismarck and Fargo. My job was simple: keep the bathrooms clean and restock the vending machines from 10 p.m. until 6 a.m. The building itself was a relic, one of those utilitarian designs from the 1970s, isolated by acres of flat, scrubby prairie that stretched out toward the inky black sky. Frank had worked there for 30 years. He always told me, "You see things out here, kid, but you don't talk about them." He spoke less about the road and more about the strange, silent travelers who sometimes stopped. People who never looked at you, never bought anything, and whose vehicles made no noise as they came or went. The first few weeks were uneventful, a monotonous cycle of silence broken only by the hiss of the ice machine and the occasional weary trucker. But then, the cars started. They were always older models, immaculately clean, with dark, tinted windows, and they always parked in the furthest unlit spots. The wrongness would begin subtly, like a slight pressure headache behind my eyes. The real shift began with the sounds, or rather, the non-sounds. One night, around 2 a.m., I was mopping the women's restroom when the lights flickered and then steadied. I heard the unmistakable, heavy clunk of the main door opening and closing. Someone was in the facility. I straightened up, expecting to see a tired family. But the hallway was empty, and the only noise was the low hum of the ceiling fans. I walked to the window. The parking lot was full of semi-trucks, but no passenger car, and no one was walking across the asphalt. I checked both bathrooms and the utility closet. Nothing. It happened again 20 minutes later. The distinct, heavy clunk. This time, I moved fast. As I reached the door, I saw the handle depress down an inch, hold for a moment, and then slowly release. But when I ripped the door open, the concrete steps outside were empty, and the night air was still. This wasn't a draft. The latch was heavy-duty. Over the next few nights, the activity escalated. The vending machines would dispense items on their own, the plastic cups dropping to the tray with a hollow echo. Though no money had been inserted, I'd find quarters stacked in perfect, neat columns on the counter. But the coins were always the wrong year, from the 1940s or 50s. Impossibly worn, and faintly smelling of dust and ozone. Frank became even quieter, his eyes perpetually fixed on the parking lot. He drew my attention to the silence. "The cars," he whispered one night, pointing toward a black 1960s sedan that had just pulled up in the farthest spot. "Their engines don't cool down. Never hear the tick, tick, tick." He was right. Every other vehicle in the lot made small noises as the metal cooled. This one was absolute, dead silence. I watched as the driver's side door slowly opened. A figure emerged, tall and thin, wearing a perfectly crisp, outdated suit. The figure didn't look at the building or at the trucks. It simply stood for a minute, facing the open prairie. Then, it got back into the car and drove away without its headlights ever turning on. One terrifying Tuesday, the power went out completely, plunging the entire facility into oppressive blackness. I fumbled for my emergency flashlight. Just as the beam cut through the darkness, I saw it, a woman standing in the main lobby, directly under where the lights should have been. She was wearing a dress that looked like it was made of shadow, clinging to a thin, skeletal frame. Her eyes were not visible, replaced by deep, unlit hollows. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. She didn't approach. She simply stood there, dripping water onto the linoleum floor. Her presence wasn't aggressive, but deeply, suffocatingly sad, like the accumulated grief of 100 forgotten journeys. As I stood paralyzed, she began to raise a hand, a long, thin, unnaturally pale arm reaching toward me. The pressure in my head became unbearable, like my skull was being squeezed. Then the power snapped back on with a blinding flash and a loud hum. The woman was gone. The only evidence was the small, dark puddle of water that quickly began to evaporate under the harsh fluorescent light, leaving behind no residue, no stain, just a slight, metallic smell. I grabbed my keys, punched out, and didn't look back. I called Frank from my car, parked 10 miles down the road, and quit. He didn't argue. He just said, "They wanted you to see them, son. That's the scariest part. They wanted to be remembered." I never drove that stretch of I-94 again. Sometimes, late at night, I'll hear the phantom clunk of a heavy door, and I can still see the perfectly neat stack of oxidized quarters on my bedside table, a terrifying souvenir I don't remember bringing home. The quiet of that place never left me, and I know that whatever those silent travelers are, they are still waiting on that lonely mile of road. The first time I saw the house, I knew something was wrong with the way the shadows fell. They didn't just darken the corners. They seemed to cling to the walls, thick and possessive, even in the midday sun. This wasn't just old house charm. This was an emotional atmosphere of profound, lingering coldness that had nothing to do with the temperature. I learned later that the property, nestled deep in the wooded hills outside Asheville, North Carolina, was known locally as the Lyman House, named for the family who vanished there in 1958. We had bought it cheap, sight unseen, lured by the promise of quiet mountain living and an impossibly low price tag. My partner, Ben, and I were looking for an escape, a place to renovate and start a bed and breakfast. The house itself was beautiful or massive, 2-story Queen Anne with wraparound porches and huge, sweeping eaves. It was remote, about 3 miles up a winding, unpaved road. We spent the first week simply clearing out decades of accumulated junk. The house felt heavy, full of latent energy, but we dismissed it as the natural ambience of an antique structure. Ben joked that the previous owners had just been hoarders, not ghosts. The only unsettling discovery was in the master bedroom closet, a thick layer of salt spread across the floor, meticulously raked into a perfect circle, nearly 6 feet wide, and undisturbed. The subtle disturbances started with the books. We had cleared the living room shelves, intending to paint, but every morning, a specific volume, always a brittle, unmarked copy of a 19th century poetry collection, would be moved from the kitchen, counter back onto the mantelpiece. We'd move it back, only to find it returned by dawn. It wasn't vandalism. The house was completely secure. Then came the sense. At night, a powerful, cloying aroma of burnt sugar and pine resin would permeate the house, strong enough to wake me, yet vanish the moment I opened the bedroom door. Ben couldn't smell it at all, which made me feel increasingly isolated and paranoid. I started sleeping with a flashlight, not because I feared an intruder, but because I feared the silence when the smells faded. The real terror began when the silence gave way to communication. One evening, while scraping wallpaper in the dining room, I heard a noise that sounded exactly like a child, giggling, a quick, breathy sound that came from the floorboards directly beneath my feet. I froze, my heart hammering against my ribs. I called out, "Hello, is anyone down there?" There was no reply, only the heavy, echoing silence of the empty house. The next night, Ben and I were sitting by the fireplace when a small, clear marble one we'd never seen before rolled out from under the hearth, and stopped exactly in the middle of the rug, as if gently pushed. Ben picked it up, examined it, and tossed it into the firebox, commenting on how strange it was. That night, I heard the marble roll again. I bolted upright in bed. The sound was coming from inside the wall, a slow, continuous click-roll-click that followed a perfect, short trajectory before reversing and starting over, sounding like something traveling back and forth in a confined, hollow space. I couldn't take it anymore. The next day, I found the town historian, a skeptical woman who reluctantly told me the full story of the Lyman house. In 1958, the patriarch, Arthur Lyman, had lost his entire family, his wife and 2 young children, to a mysterious, sudden illness. The official report was food poisoning, but the locals whispered it was something darker. Arthur, driven mad by grief, bricked himself into the master bedroom closet before he too disappeared. The salt circle I found? It was an old Appalachian Ripula barrier, she claimed, meant to keep something in or out. The sounds of the rolling marble, the scent of pine resin, the giggling, these were all tied to the Lyman children and the dark ritual Arthur performed to try and save them, or perhaps keep them with him. That night, alone, armed with this knowledge, I decided I had to break the pattern. The marble was rolling relentlessly in the wall, next to the bed, faster now, more aggressive. I gripped the sledgehammer we were using for demolition and walked into the master bedroom. I knew exactly where Arthur had bricked himself in. As I stood before the closet door, the rolling sound stopped dead. A slow, rasping breath, wet and shallow, sounded directly from behind the wood. Then, a low guttural voice, not Ben's, not Arthur's, not human, whispered my name, dragging out the syllables in a terrible, needy drawl. It wasn't asking for help. It was acknowledging a connection, a shared history in that lonely, dark space. I dropped the hammer and sprinted, convinced that if I stayed, I would somehow replace the lost family. I drove 30 miles before pulling over, sobbing uncontrollably. Ben found me later, confused but unharmed. We sold the house back to the bank for pennies, claiming structural problems. We never told them about the salt, the smells, or the marble. I'm safe now, thousands of miles away, in a sterile, modern apartment. But sometimes, when I'm walking on a cold wood floor, I can feel a distinct pressure beneath my feet, and I hear a faint click-roll-click in the dead, quiet center of the night. The rule was simple: never turn off the cameras, especially the ones focused on the archives. I worked as a night watchman at the Public Records Building in Providence, Rhode Island, a monolithic structure of granite and concrete built in the 1930s. Most people picture spooky Victorian mansions when they think of ghosts, but the deepest dread I ever felt was in the sterile, air-conditioned silence of those endless rows of metal filing cabinets. It was a place designed to store the cold, hard facts of life and death, and yet, it seemed to actively refuse to let go of the emotional residue of the documents themselves. My routine was mechanical: patrol all 7 floors, check the perimeter doors, and monitor the wall of CCTV screens in the basement office. The archives floors 2 through 6 were locked down, climate, and filled with thousands of forgotten lives, tax records, adoption papers, divorce decrees, and death certificates dating back to centuries. The atmosphere on those floors was oppressive, thick with the smell of old paper and dust. The chief guard, a man named Henderson, had given me one piece of advice on my first night: if you see something on the monitor that doesn't make sense, log it, but don't go look, especially not on the 5th floor. The 5th floor housed the vital statistics: birth, marriage, and death records. It was where the initial, subtle disturbances began. Every night, around 3:17 a.m., The camera trained on aisle 7, section D, would show the exact same anomaly. A single file box, sitting innocently on a shelf, would slowly and silently slide forward about an inch, hesitate, and then slide back into place. It was impossible to attribute it to drafts or structural shifts. The movement was deliberate, singular, and always confined to that one box. I checked the logs. The box contained records from a mass epidemic in the 1890s. The files were fragile and brittle. I began timing it, waiting for 3:17 a.m. with a growing cold anticipation. The visual anomaly soon transitioned into auditory events. When I was on the 4th floor, I started hearing soft, almost imperceptible sounds emanating from the floor above the 5th. It sounded like the very gentle, dry rustling of paper being handled. Quickly, efficiently, like an invisible clerk was meticulously sorting through files. I would check the door alarms. Everything was sealed tight. Then, the sound changed. It became the sound of weeping up, profoundly quiet, utterly desolate sound that was more sensation than noise, echoing down the empty steel stairwell. It wasn't the sound of an intruder or a living person. It was the sound of something trapped, forever reading and reliving the grief contained in those old papers. One night, the entity on the 5th floor seemed to take a direct interest in me. I was watching the CCTV screen when the camera feed for aisle 7, section D, flickered. When it cleared, the camera was no longer pointed at the shelf of boxers. It was pointing directly at the camera itself, or rather, the ceiling tile behind it, completely askew, as if someone had physically climbed the shelves and twisted the lens 180 degrees. My blood ran cold. I knew the cameras were bolted into the steel structure and couldn't be easily moved. One felt a paralyzing weight, realizing that whatever was in the archives was not a phantom echo. It was intelligent, aware, and now it knew I was watching. The fear reached its peak on a Thursday night. At 3:17 a.m., the weeping sound intensified, echoing loudly down the entire stairwell. I looked at the monitor for the 5th floor. Not only was the camera still facing the ceiling, but now a shadow moved across the frame, long and elongated, despite the constant fluorescent lighting. It was the shape of a person, tall and unnaturally thin. And then, the shadow moved closer to the lens, filling the screen with a dense, absolute darkness. At that moment, the speaker next to my monitor, usually silent, crackled with static. A slow, dry whisper, like a fingernail dragging across old parchment, emerged from the speaker. "Find it." "The last one." "I didn't think," I reacted, driven by a terror more primal than any common fear. I burst from the office, scrambled up the steel stairs, and rushed to the 5th floor. I jammed my key into the lock, throwing the door open. The weeping and the rustling stopped instantly. The air was bone-chillingly cold and utterly still. I flicked on my flashlight. Aisle 7, section D. I ran to the shelf. The box was still there, sitting perfectly straight, but underneath it, on the polished concrete floor, was a single sheet of paper, thin, yellowed, and torn. It was a fragment of a death certificate, listing a name and a date from 1892. The cause of death was left blank, replaced by a single, carefully drawn symbol that looked like a jagged, burning eye. I immediately backed away, heart pounding, never taking my eyes off the symbol. I slammed the door shut and ran back to the basement, leaving the scrap of paper on the floor. I didn't stop to log the event. I simply called Henderson, told him I was resigning immediately, and walked out into the pre-dawn light. I never returned to collect my last paycheck. I still keep a copy of that name I saw on the paper. I look at it often, haunted by the thought that I was supposed to do something with it, or that I was only intended to be the one who found the final piece of someone's terrifying, unfinished record. The truth is, I don't know what the last one was, but I know that whatever it is, it's still organizing the secrets in that silent granite tomb.